Hello students, welcome to our Read Aloud. Today in my message I mentioned that we would be getting back to studying George Washington as a famous American and as a famous Virginian. So here we go. A picture book of George Washington. So this is an information book but with hand-drawn illustrations by David Adler, illustrated by John and Alexandra Wallner. And on the front, I see a boy or young man riding on a horse with a dog, very smiley, by a river out in the country. And there's maybe like a little farmhouse up on a hill. Here we go. A picture book of George Washington. Oh, hey, in there, I guess he's fishing. Here we go. George Washington was born on February 22nd, 1732, in a simple Virginia farmhouse. At that time, Virginia was an English colony. Young George liked to fish and go boating. He watched ships that sailed past on the nearby river, but most of all, he liked to ride his horse. George learned to read and write in school. He practiced his handwriting by copying lists of rules such as keep your fingers clean and think before you speak. But his favorite subject was arithmetic. That's math. So it's interesting. He may have been born in a simple Virginia farmhouse, but his family must have been pretty well off enough to send him to school and for him to have time to go to a real school. When George was 11, his father died. George helped his mother run their farm and watch his younger sisters and brothers. One day, George found some surveying tools that had belonged to his father. He used them to measure and map a turnip field and a pine forest. He liked surveying. So that's when you look at the land using these tools and then you measure it, right? You measure the land and you can do that to draw maps. At 16, George was very tall and looked much older. He was given a job surveying land in the Virginia wilderness. So there he is, tall George, getting his job. In 1753, when George Washington was 21, he joined the Virginia Army. He rode to the Ohio Valley to warn the French to get off English land. In 1754, the French and Indian War began. George Washington fought on the side of England. He led Virginia soldiers against the French. George was known as a brave and good leader throughout the 13 American colonies. So remember, because Virginia was owned by England, he was fighting for England against the French. When George was 26, he fell in love with Martha Custis. She was a wealthy widow with 2 children. They married and moved to Mount Vernon, the Virginia home and farm, which once belonged to George's brother. The English won their long war against the French. King George III of England wanted the American colonies to help pay for the cost of the war, so he taxed them. American colonists refused to pay the taxes. In Boston, colonists dumped tea into the harbor rather than pay the tax on it. So what is tax? Tax is the extra little bit of money that you pay every time you buy something, and that tax usually goes to the government to do stuff, to run schools or the police or whatever. But King George wanted to tax the colonists to pay for the war they had just had against the French. And the colonists didn't agree. In April 1775, fighting between England and her American colonies began near Boston, at Lexington, and at Concord, Massachusetts. 1 month later, leaders of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia. George Washington was chosen to lead the Continental Army. Often there were not enough uniforms, food, blankets, and guns for George Washington's soldiers. So what happened was the colonists didn't want to pay the tax, and everybody got madder and madder at each other until a war started, right? And George Washington led the Continental Army. He led the colonies. The war lasted 8 years. George Washington and the Continental Army fought bravely. In 1783, when the American colonies won the war, George Washington was a hero. The 13 colonies became 13 states. They joined together and formed a government, but it was weak. In 1787, a new government was formed with a Congress, a Supreme Court, and a president. George Washington was the best known, most loved leader in America. He was elected the first president of the United States of America in 1789. He was reelected in 1792. President George Washington signed treaties with the Indians, Spain, and England. There was a war in Europe, but George Washington kept the United States out of it. When some farmers in Pennsylvania refused to pay tax on whiskey, George Washington sent soldiers to force the farmers to obey the law. In 1797, after 8 years as president, George Washington returned to his home at Mount Vernon. Each morning he rode across his large farm on horseback. He really liked riding horses, and he really loved being home at his farm. Sometimes he rode 15 miles north of Mount Vernon to watch the building of a new city. It would be the capital of the United States, and it would be named after him. It would be called Washington. So there he is sitting on his horse looking over a hill, and this is like the building of Washington, D.C. that we know now. It's just across the river, right? The capital of our country. Then in 1799, George Washington became ill and died. He was 67 years old. George Washington was a great leader. He has been called the father of our country. It has been said that George Washington was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. And there he is, and also there's another symbol of the United States, right? The bald eagle. So that's to kick off our learning, to go back to our learning, to remind us about some of the information we may have already learned about George Washington. And I hope you enjoyed the read aloud. Don't forget to keep washing your hands, cover your coughs and sneezes, do some reading, do some writing, help your family around the house, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.